So I've been asked to remind everybody to put their phones on silence. So I've already put mine on it. And so if you start hearing the music from Law and Order, then that's my fault. But I think I turned everything off. Yeah. Thanks again, Annie, and thanks for inviting me. I grew up in Bloomington, went to Kennedy High School, went to school down in Des Moines at Drake University, and joined the Peace Corps like the month after I graduated from Drake. And I went to a little country in West Africa called Togo. So I actually got to learn to speak French because, I took French in high school, I took French in college, but I actually learned how to speak French in Togo, which got me this sort of love of all things overseas and stuff. When I was in high school in Bloomington, I worked on various political campaigns. And when I was a student, I worked in various presidential campaigns as well. And it just captured me, the possibilities of the principles of democracy in other countries, where I was a Peace Corps volunteer in a country where you could not say the president's name. You didn't want to say his name, which was Etienne Nasingbe Yadama. And so we called him Stevie Wonder, because Etienne in French is Stephen. So we called him Stevie Wonder, and he was supposed to have done all sorts of miraculous things. And I think that was one of the things that really stuck with me, was that lack of being able to speak freely. Throughout my career, I worked for the Carter Center, President Carter, in Liberia and in Ghana, and in Atlanta, and doing various other things. I had the opportunity to work for an organization that's still in existence. It's somehow survived the budget cuts and everything, called the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And we used to get people that would come there looking for work, and they thought it was electrical. So that was an interesting, a really wonderful not-for-profit organization. And the origin of US support for democratic transition comes from Ronald Reagan, of all people, Ronald Reagan. These organizations, IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and the International Republican Institute were all set up by the interventions of Ronald Reagan during his time as president, in order to bring the principles and push them out there. The idea is that other societies might want to take these processes and policies and implement them themselves to improve their governance, to lessen possibilities of armed conflict, and to boost economic and social development. Sort of a whole package there, which goes along with sort of what USAID did for, I don't know, was it 60 some years before it was dissolved earlier this year by the current administration. So that's how I got interested in all of those sorts of things. I went back and worked for Peace Corps as a staff member in Guinea-Conakry, which is, so we were driving to a small place to place, this is a paid professional job after I'd been a volunteer, to deposit one of our volunteers in this village that had agreed to accept him. And we drive into town, in this dusty town, and obviously there had once been a gas station there, and it was probably a Shell gas station there. But what the sign said now was bienvenue, which is welcome, bienvenue à hell. The S went missing somewhere and stuff, and we thought, oh, well, that's really, the volunteers will really like this. And he did okay. He did his 2 years and did okay. And after I worked on that, I ended up going with the United Nations, with UNDP, to Liberia, which had just had the first round of its civil war, and during which the UN was thrown out, and so they were going back in, and they asked me to go with them and help them reestablish in Liberia, which brought me a whole series of things, mitzvahs, since it's it's Yom Kippur, mitzvahs of things that happened to me with hooking up with the Carter Center, and working for President Carter in Liberia, and then being evacuated out of there and working for the Carter Center in Ghana, and really getting to understand more about democracy assistance, providing technical assistance to election management bodies. We don't have quite the same sort of system here, but in the international standard, which the US doesn't do, is that there might be an independent election management body, the people who administer all of the elections. And they're set up as an independent institution, and that's in order to help be something of a bulwark against different kinds of manipulation and corruption and those sorts of things. And in many places, it actually does work. So I worked in Liberia. I worked in Liberia on elections that actually elected Charles Taylor, you know, the bad guy who started the war in Liberia. And he's now in prison. He was convicted at the International Criminal Court, and he's in prison in Britain. So it's good for him, because that's kind of where he belonged and everything. So that went along. And I've worked in a whole range of activities with, and it's nice to see so many women here with at least one guy. Because in my work, I was almost always the only woman in the room. Almost always, even up to my last position with USAID in Haiti as a senior election advisor. Almost always the only woman in the room. So it became an interesting way of moving along. You had to be better, you had to be smarter, you had to be quicker, you had to have a good sense of humor. Hopefully that comes through. And you had to be, you know, just on top of all of these issues. And the things with doing this kind of assistance, which is pertinent for here in the US as well, is many of the issues are the same, right? Voter registration, who's entitled to vote? Who's entitled to register? And trying to put lots of requirements for that. In most other places in the world, at least the ones that I've worked in, voter registration requires that they take biometric data. Photograph is a biometric. Fingerprints are biometric. Iris scan is a biometric. And so they will do, in Haiti, they do all of those. It's a little bit too much, but anyway, that's what they've got. And they still can't agree about who should be registered and who votes and all of the rest of it. So this is an ongoing challenge with many of the same sorts of issues that we have here about, you know, who can register, who can vote, voter ID, all of those sorts of issues. The same ones keep popping up all around the world. I, at one point, we can talk about voter fraud, right? So I've been doing some research on voter fraud. Go to the Heritage Foundation's website and look for voter fraud. They've done an extensive database and research on voter fraud and came up with 1,600 cases since, I think, 1994, which is, that's not a lot. That's like 0.00000 something, 1%. Minnesota had 134 cases. And most of those were felons who voted erroneously when they weren't supposed to. And you can actually look and see at the citation, the legal citation, as to who they were by name, the people who were offenders, and how all of that worked out. It's interesting because all around the world, voter fraud is, oh, I lost because you cheated. I remember sitting in this is in Ghana, which was a very good experience and a very good example of how US money, US tax money, because that's what USAID was, provided technical expertise and some commodities and equipment to get them to be able to redo and rethink how they did their elections, how they did their voter registration. They used the optical mark, just like we do with the ballots, you fill in the little oval. They did their whole voter registration like that, which went really quickly, and they all knew how to do it, because guess what? Ghana's been doing standardized school tests since the 1960s. So they knew how to do those forms and everything, and we were able to get them processed using good Minnesota equipment, DRE, provided the scanners and stuff for those programs. But you know, you can adapt and put technical innovations in, and people will then say, well, but you know, really, that's not really true. They did this, they did that. We don't agree. We don't believe the results. The overwhelming thing about all of my experience is it doesn't matter what you do. It matters what people believe about what you do. And if they don't believe, it's really hard to get them back. And it's always been that way, of it being, you know, incredibly hard to get them back. So we're talking about voter fraud and people double voting and all of this stuff and people not believing. I sat in the chairman of the election commission in Ghana's office in 1992. I was working for the Carter Center, and he's a lovely, lovely guy, the chairman, ex-chairman now, he's retired. But he sat there and he had a woman candidate from a constituency far up in the north of Ghana. And he sat there and he was holding her hand and sort of patting it like this. And he was saying, my dear, you lost by 10,000 votes. Yes, but you know, they cheated. You lost by 10,000 votes. You lost by 10,000 votes. And he had kept saying that for like an hour. And finally, it occurred to her that, yeah, she lost by 10,000 votes. But it took that kind of convincing of people about how this works. Voter fraud in the United States is almost non-existent. But it does exist, and we have to go after it, right? But it doesn't exist to the level where it would change the outcome. And that's the kind of thing. People will do all sorts of dumb stuff, and they'll cheat. And that's what happened. And that's what I got from the chairman's, you lost by 10,000 votes, you know, and keep on doing those things. I've seen really wonderful experiences with democracy assistance, like in Ghana, which that programming made, which took place between about 1994 and about the year 2000, made a huge difference in Ghana. Now they have elections, they're not perfect, but they have the party in power loses and the other party comes in, and they even had a president die in office, and they didn't have a terrible kerfuffle. They went back to their constitution and figured it out, and they went with that process. So it can be incredibly, incredibly successful. And then you can have one, and I do have to say, when Charles Taylor got elected in Liberia in 98, he did get elected, but it's easy to get elected, right? When you have your people march up and down the main road, which went right in front of the American embassy, and they were yelling, he killed our ma, he killed our pa, but we vote for the pape. That was Taylor, the pape, right? Because this was in the middle of a civil war. And when you say the war starts the next day if I don't win. So it's pretty easy for that sort of political messaging and stuff to overcome everything else that you do. On the other hand, I also worked for the UN. One of my best moments was working for the UN in East Timor. This would have been 1999. East Timor, a little island off the north coast of Australia. Half of it had always been, or for a long, long time, been Indonesian. Other half had been Portuguese. The Portuguese in the 70s up and left because, you know, they up and left. And the Indonesians came in and were not at all pleasant to the local population. They tried to starve them to death. They went through it. It was incredibly brutal. And the UN had been working on finding a solution for this, which was to give the Timorese people the right to vote whether they wanted to choose. Do you want to stay with Indonesia or do you want to become independent? So I had some people that I knew that reached out and asked me if I wanted to go and be part of this UN mission that would actually conduct a referendum. We had to call it the Popular Consultation on Independence because you couldn't use the word referendum. So we didn't use that word, the Popular Consultation. So I went, I told my mom I was going to Indonesia, which technically was true at the time. And she found out I was in East Timor because that was, I mean, this was a kind of a big thing going on by seeing me on television with Maria Ressa. So that was not so good. But anyway, but I was in Indonesia at that time. And the most amazing thing happened. The Timorese came out in numbers. They came out early. They stood face up to these gangs, which were organized, directed, funded, trained by the Indonesian military. And they stood up and they came out and voted overwhelmingly, right? And then the Indonesian military knew what was going to happen with the results, because before you even counted the ballots, you could tell. And many of the Timorese disappeared into the mountains to the camps that were run by the rebel group to be safe, to be taken care of. And the Indonesians kind of went a bit crazy and burnt everything down and attacked everything. And yeah. And I was evacuated with I was the officer in charge, and we got evacuated on a Royal Australian Air Force C-130 and went to Darwin. And they told us that it was the largest number of people ever transported on a Royal Australian Air Force C-130. It was like 170 passengers plus the crew. We had people standing in the cockpit and sitting out on the tail end and stuff to get in. It's a good thing we had a long runway to take off and a long runway to land on with all of that. But it was an amazing transformation of those people. They stood up. They went to the mountains where they were safe with the rebel group. And the rebel group, with all of this provocation going on, did not come down the mountain. They knew what the Indonesians would do. They planned for it. They stocked up food and water and shelter to bring all of the people up there that wanted to come up and stay with us. We're not going down the mountain, because if they went down, this would spark a war with Indonesia, and the Indonesians would never leave. But they knew how to manage that. Indonesia destroyed most of the country, and more than a few thousand people were killed and injured and stuff. But at the end of the day, they got their freedom. It's what is worthwhile to stand up for. They understood the process. The UN, we conducted it mostly with our Timorese staff, but we oversaw all of the process of registering people and how did you register them and who was eligible for registration. And then we actually conducted the polling. That was an amazing example of people showing up and taking their future in their hands and being organized on how to do it. That simple act of whatever happens, the rebels are not coming down the mountain. We're staying up here where the Indonesians would not go. We're staying here. We're not going there. That kind of standing up in the face of it, I always think about, and it's always incredibly inspiring. So, yeah.
So, today.
Timor-Leste.
It is.
It's Timor-Leste, which is the name of the country officially now, which still means East Timor, but it's in the Tetun language, and they are an independent country, and they have their ups and downs, and they're tiny, but they're still there, and they're still working at moving themselves forward. By the way, that was the only mission in the UN history where national staff, because most of the people who worked for the UN, actually most of the people who worked for USAID were host country nationals, people from there, not Americans, not Europeans or anything. That was the only mission ever in the history of the UN where the UN evacuated national staff. We flew them from Dili, the capital of East Timor, into Australia, more than 2,000 of them. Why? Because they were specifically being targeted by the gangs because they worked for the UN. And you could see it. And there were a number of them who were killed and injured because of that work. Yeah. Well, it took a while. It also took several thousand Australian and New Zealand troops to come in and stabilize the area. The US provided the logistics and the intelligence gathering and all of that kind of stuff to get that done. And then there was a whole big plan of negotiations with the Indonesians to get them to leave. Unfortunately, some of our UN colleagues who were in West Timor, which was Indonesian, there was a camp there. It was a little enclave of East Timor in West Timor. I don't know. And that was overrun by one of the gangs, and several of the UN staff there were killed before this all was resolved. I was able to go back to East Timor in 2002, for the independence, 2002, 2003, for their independence celebration, which was amazing, really, really quite something for the whole world to do that. So sometimes it can work. Other places, I worked in Haiti off and on for years, and it's in its worst condition now than it's ever been. So it's a tough one between, what works and what doesn't. The one thing which I find that is true is there can be a lot of heroism and a lot of people who really believe in democratic process, but it's not a straight line towards progress. It kind of goes, it goes all over the place. You can't say that there's a straight trajectory towards progress. It comes and it goes and it goes and it comes. The one thing that is true is that it requires vigilance all the time. Vigilance all the time. The rules have to be set. The rules have to be educated out to people. There has to be participation in developing those rules, right? So that people feel like they've had a say in how this is all being organized. And then what we do here in the US is all of us, we're part of it, many of us, not some of us haven't gotten to that point yet. But what we always used to talk about as an election administrator describing elections in the US is the little old ladies with blue hair and tennis shoes showing up in the church basement. And that's how elections get run in America. Those are your neighbors, those are your friends, those are your colleagues. And that still has to be that. And who else would you believe other than your friends and your neighbors? So I would say for this group, I'm really excited that I'm sort of now here in Minnesota and situated here in Plymouth and stuff, to really and gotten over the trauma of being doged last March. So what to do? But lucky enough to be able to sort of retire, but not really retire, and work on these issues here in the US, where more education, more information through better channels and different means of communicating with the public, to have that belief in our friends and our neighbors, right? Because that's how elections are done in America. It's about our friends and our neighbors showing up and trying to build those bridges so that we can believe in each other. Because that's the bottom line. And yes, defend democracy requires eternal vigilance. Can never turn your back on it. So, other questions, comments?
Denise, tell us more stories. We're doing great on time.
Oh, okay.
You are our.
Oh, okay. So yeah. Yo. Yeah. So the countries where we've worked and developed good partnerships, some of the countries we worked in, frankly, it was never going to move forward. This was just a way of placating, or things change because you don't have perfect control over your environment. I would say Russia, after the wall fell and all of that, was a lot of effort in doing a lot of stuff in Russia. And then everything sort of changed. That's that thing about not a steady trajectory going up. But places like Ghana, East Timor, even some of the other places in Africa, Serbia and Montenegro, where I also worked after the war in Serbia, And even a place like Iraq, right? Even Iraq, where I also worked, you can see a trajectory where you have a little bit more and it's easier to talk to them. It's easier to have that interaction. And then you get spectacular successes. You know who paid for the UN in East Timor? The United States of America paid a big chunk of that. So whenever you see the UN doing these things, it doesn't get done if the US doesn't step up. So it's that thing about building bridges, about being able to work together. It's kind of the reason why the Peace Corps remains important, right? If you go through and you look at the records of leaders overseas in countries that have had Peace Corps, how many of them had Peace Corps teachers? Lots and lots and lots. It's that idea that they can have a better situation in their own country so they all don't want to rush and come here. Ghana, there's not, as far as I'm aware of, and I've looked into this a bit, there's not a massive number of Ghanaians. The economics in Ghana are really tough, and those come and go as well, but they don't have the same thing where the economics are tough and then the government is trying to crush you, right? And it's that, don't do this part. The economics part is another part of the overall equation, but yeah, it can work like that. And it can create a whole line of people, officials within a government and stuff, a foreign government, that makes it easier to communicate with them. You have a point of reference with them. You have some common understanding about how things are supposed to work, even if they don't always work that way. So there's a whole thing about, and then you can look at countries that where none of that stuff has worked and where governments are truly a failed state, and you can see how difficult that is. I worked in Somalia 3 times, and it's one time was building schools, so for Save the Children UK and stuff, but it's a really difficult place because for whatever the reasons, socio-historic, economic, everything else, they've just not been able to kind of reach above that. Although the northern part of Somalia, which is sometimes called Somaliland, although not officially, you know, they sort of have elections there, and they're calmer, and they're trying to get to a different level with democratic process and stuff. So it just becomes, I think, going to thinking about Afghanistan, and I worked both for the UN and then I worked for a not-for-profit called Counterpart International, but we were working on with civil society on how they could support elections and local Afghans monitoring the elections and doing all those things. And that was another place where it just never went any deeper. No matter what you tried, it never really got into that deeper thing. In large part because there were still all these people around who were blowing people up and shooting them, and you know, and so it was this thing never got that never got relieved and removed from the place. I mean, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? You know, I had so many wonderful experiences and working with so many great election administrators who took their experience from the US, working on elections here, and could take it overseas, and the nonpartisan sense. I mean, when Charles Taylor was running for president of Liberia, and I was the chief technical advisor to the election commission, I didn't, you know, they're going to pick whoever they're going to pick. Did I think Charles Taylor would be a great pick? Of course not. Did I think he was going to win? Of course. I saw the protesters, you know, I saw them going up and down and all the rest of that sort of thing. Sometimes, but you're not involved personally in the politics of it, right? You're at that little bit of that little bit of a distance that can make things really hum for you and help you, make you have better insights into what's going on, because you're not emotionally involved. You're not caught up in the whole thing. One of the great people, American election administrator that I worked with a lot, was a guy named Joe Baxter, rest his soul. We worked together in Ghana, and he used to be, he started his life and his career in elections working in New Orleans as the personal secretary to the head of the election commission in New Orleans. Okay. And part of his job with a few, they were brought in to help clean up elections in New Orleans, which were pretty messy. This was back when Carter was running for president. And I never forget Joe, who was from Magnus, Arkansas, and had a really good Southern accent. I was like, those Carter people, I tell you, they were paying walking round money with checks. Now, walking round money is, it was New Orleans. That's what the people were doing, but they were paying them with checks. You're not supposed to. Kind of, yeah. I mean, it kind of, and those sorts of things. And later, I got to know Joe because he was brought to Washington D.C. in the early '90s, where there was a similar problem with really, really bad elections. And so he came up with one of his colleagues, Emmett Fremo from the commission down in New Orleans and stuff, and they came up. And one of the things that Joe did was he was the registrar of voters for a while. And y'all remember when John Hinckley shot President Reagan? Okay. That hotel in Washington is referred to as the Hinckley Hilton. It's still there and still a hotel last time I checked. Anyway, John Hinckley was found that he was not competent to stand trial, so he was committed to the St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which was a secured psychiatric hospital. And so every time there was an election, he tried to register to vote. And Joe would have to go to St. E's and explain to him, is this kind of like the felons who registered to vote and stuff? Well, he was right there, there, he wasn't going anywhere. He was held captive there, which was part of the issue. So Joe would have to go over to St. E's with a couple of other people, and they would have to sit down and explain to him and to several other people that he had tried to get to register and stuff, that the law in the District of Columbia is that you must be a regular and voluntary resident of the District of Columbia. The voluntary thing was kind of, well, the regular was also, because that wasn't happening either. They weren't very regular and stuff. So this kind of thing went on and on and on. And then Joe sort of ran away with the circus and went overseas and was part of the gang that worked on the whole election system redesign in Ghana. That was incredibly, incredibly successful. So, we would have Americans that came from working on elections in, District of Columbia or Albemarle County, Virginia. These are just some of the places, and we used them and brought them with. And then we also had people from Australian Election Commission. By the way, in Australia, if you don't vote, you can get fined. Yes, and in Belgium as well. Yep. When you're out of Peru, they have a hard time getting you, but the Aussies are really good at getting you and stuff. So we would bring over these Australian who were great because they knew everything. They knew voter registration, voter education, election law, the regular and voluntary part of all of this, which is in the law. And just the mix of people. We had people from Italy and Spain, Portugal, several from the UK, Germans, from all over the world working on these projects all together. And so what you were able to give to the country you were working in was a various perspectives on the same set of processes and questions. And how do you want to do that? In Afghanistan, when I was there with the UN, I was told I wasn't supposed to say, you should do this. Well, I was a technical advisor. So that gets to be a little weird. But anyway, so what I came up with the chairman of the election commission was, if you really are confused and you don't get it, you just need to pull me aside when we're just in your office and say, what would you do? And then I can tell you, because you asked me a question. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I would do. And he was like, oh yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Let's do that. And it became, you know, Afghanistan was one where I don't know what you do when people say to you, let's have elections in part of the country at this state, and then we'll have elections in the rest of the country up there. It's like, okay, well, how are you going to keep the results from down here? Secret. How are you going to do that? And you know, if you're doing that, that line where it snows down here in the wintertime and it never snows up here, that line, guess what that also indicates? Two different ethnic groups. So how are you gonna do this? Working through those kinds of problems, going to the State Department right before the first elections in Iraq, I think this was 2005, and with colleagues from IRI and NDI, and we're sitting there and people from the State Department are talking about this and they're worried about all the security and all the rest of that stuff. And somebody from the State Department says, so we're thinking we're just gonna tell them to turn the cell phone system off. And all three of us together were like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Well, you know, the phones, they can set off bombs. I said, yeah, of course they can. But they can also like not come out and vote. Nobody will come and vote. You turn the phones off. Everybody will be so freaked out, they'll stay home. Also, what happens in these areas is they send a couple of the guys out, young guys out, to go vote, see what it's like, talk to the neighbors, see what it's like. Then they call home. Yeah, it's okay. You can come now. You can come now. And that's exactly what happened, not just in Iraq, it happened in Afghanistan. It has happened virtually every country I've worked in, except maybe some of the really early ones where they didn't have cell phones. But then they would bring small boys with them. I was always a boy. They'd bring a small boy with them and you'd see kids running out and they were running home to tell the women and other people to come. You can come now. And it's okay, it's safe to vote. So it's providing the same background and stuff. When I look at things here in the US, I'm very troubled. We in Minnesota are quite lucky with, you know, really high turnout and really good and clean elections. If you go to that database at the Heritage Foundation website, you'll find like 135 cases in Minnesota. And then you can sort them out by the different offenses that they've had. Almost all, overwhelmingly, the largest component is felons who voted when their civil rights had not been restored to them. But they registered or they attempted to register, and some of them were registered and actually voted and stuff. And of course, that's a big no-no and a big problem, but also kind of understandable, because when you get your rights restored, and what does that mean, and how do you prove that, and all the rest of it can be really, really difficult to do. In other states, there wasn't a single one of these. The only elections that got overturned and stuff were in various places in Texas, you know. And it was not really, I sat there and I read the documents that they had posted. It was really not quite clear exactly what happened in those, but they were in Texas. Now this is an election that's being overturned because of election fraud, not an election that had to be recounted because it was too close. You know, those being completely separate things. And one of the other big things of my experience has been finding out the difference between voter fraud or fraudulent behavior at a polling place and somebody making a mistake. Because that making a mistake thing happens a lot. But that's why if you have an opportunity to observe elections, to monitor elections, it's a really good thing. I did this in the last midterms out in Litchfield, and we actually found a problem. Well, we caught it before then. They were having a lot of trouble with Minnesota uses optical mark recognition ballot boxes, OptiScans, right? So the ballot goes in, and it goes in, and you can see the number goes from 1 to 2, and your ballot went in there and it's already been counted, but you don't, nobody knows what that's about, but they know the ballot's in there. Well, these ballots were going in and popping back out. That means there's a problem somewhere on them. About 50% of them would. And so we kept watching this and watching this. It was myself and another chap, and we're opposite ends of the Catholic Church gymnasium where all of the polling centers are. Really lovely people in a really lively and lovely environment. And then we're seeing this, and this is causing a huge problem, right? A huge problem. So they're on the phone to the county attorney. The county attorney is coming. The people who print the ballots, who operate the ballot boxes, and the people who print the ballots, because they're custom printed, the little hash marks on the side are the thing that's important. And they all come out, and they figure, and finally they figure out that what it is on the back side of the ballot, because Minnesota uses front and back, right? On the back side of it, at the very bottom, on about half of the ballots, there's a printing error. And that's what's causing half of them to come out again, which will then, those are still valid. There's a box for them. They're there, and they're gonna get fixed and stuff. And so the printing guy runs off to get a new batch printed to make sure that they're correct this time and to bring them back. But in the meantime, some of the poll workers decided to be a little too helpful, right? And they took unvoted ballots, and they were fixing it with a little bit of ink. There was no intent at fraud. There was an intent to actually be really helpful, because if that would have been really helpful, except you can't do that, right? You can't actually do that. So this now involved getting the county attorney back out, and a call to the Secretary of State's office for them to say, no. And those ballots, if they haven't been put into circulation to be used, put them over there, and the guy will come. And so that polling center stayed open until like 3, 4 in the morning, because almost half of the ballots had to be counted by hand and manufactured. So the difference between human error and fraud. And mostly what happens in the United States, and in fact, overseas, most of the well, there have been a few, not everything was fraud. But anyway, one time I was in Nigeria and working for USAID, and President Carter was there. He was observing elections. This was right after the coup leader, Sani Abacha, died. Mercifully, that's what the Nigerians said. Mercifully, he's died. So now they were having elections to go back to democracy and everything. And honest to goodness, they were so cheeky that they committed fraud in front of President Carter. I was there, I saw it. They're like, they got a whole stack of the ballots, and they're marking this and this and this, and President Carter rolls up, and you can't, it's unmistakable, and they just kept going. It was really quite the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. But most fraud overseas isn't committed by that kind of stuff.
Ask you experience fraud. United States allegations of rigged elections. Does it make any difference?
You mean the allegations about our elections being rigged? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It's huge. It's huge.
The second question then is, could you talk to us a little bit about the Doge experience? Everybody.
We have to leave at 6:30.
Well, no, the Doge experience is like this. So one of the things that you might not know is that various groups of employees, just talking about USAID, but this has happened with other agencies where there were mass firings, they were let go at certain dates, right? So USAID, I was a contract technical specialist. So my contract was up, and although my office And my director wanted to continue me. Mine was done at the end of March because they were not allowed to pick up the next option on my contract. So all of the people who do almost all of them who do disaster relief, they got fired between the early February and like June. Depending, they just let their contracts all lapse because they were all contractuals, pretty much all of them. There were some career people. Foreign service officers started to be let go on July 1st, and then August 15th, and the last batch was September 2nd. So what does it mean? I mean, foreign service people are from all over the place. There's a big group of people who were doaged, or they worked for not-for-profits that were funded by USAID, and essentially they were also doaged, who have returned to Minnesota. There's a couple of groups that are around, and there are a sizable number of those people here. For many of my colleagues, the ones who were overseas, it was horrific because they would say, okay, in March, they would say, you're going on administrative leave, but you're still overseas, living in the house that the government pays for, with your kids going to the school there locally and all the rest of it. So, but you're not working. And actually, other than picking up administrative emails, you're not really supposed to be looking at your phone or your emails from them. So it was really, really traumatic for a lot of those people. So the last group was the second. Now everything that's done for USAID is at the State Department. There's no people doing the work. So if you hear that PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, that one has restarted. It's not true. Not really. And there are no people no Americans left to manage those programs. So it's been pretty traumatic all the way around. I was out in Washington in April to return my government financed equipment, my nasty 4-year-old laptop, and the cell phone that had the broken screen, and my badge and my passport, my dip passport, all of that kind of stuff. Get rid of it. And it's a really fraught environment in Washington. I mean, you'd get in the metro and you'd see people with their banker's box full of stuff because they'd just been fired. And you would see that all the time. So it's a pretty difficult environment out there. And I think, yeah. For the people who've come back to Minnesota, a number of them have been getting jobs with the state of Minnesota or local governments and stuff, because they have a lot of grants and contracts management. Even like myself, I'm a technical person, but part of what I had to do with USAID is manage grants and contracts. And so there's a number of those people are back, and there's quite a group with them. Yeah.
Based on your experience all over the world, what would you say that start to think about, just to counter that, or try to restore it? One, so it doesn't get any worse, and then.
Well, restoring it overseas will not do anything until we restore it here. Our confidence in our own systems, and get people out to vote, and bring that all back. Maybe that sounds kind of partisan to some people. It's meant as reaffirming our commitment to democracy all the way around, And until we do that and demonstrate that, then it's pretty difficult. But that would be, then we would have a plus again, Right now, none of this work is happening. None of it is, because all of those programs were cut. And there's no expectation that any of them will restart anywhere. Just like, the life-saving ones like PEPFAR, and the initiatives that have developed a vaccine for malaria. Those things are probably not gonna restart anytime soon. The US the UN has just put out a big proposal, which got passed, for supporting improved security and stuff in Haiti. Oh, that's nice, but where's the money? So it's those kinds of things that will have to happen. But to me, the biggest thing is to be here now and defend democracy.